Hi and welcome to the channel. I'm Lauro Miller and I make videos about programming. In the previous video of this JavaScript series, we talked about objects, so today we'll go one step further and we'll talk about prototype chains. Prototype chains are JavaScript's way of simulating the inheritance behavior between objects. Although the language has no real classes under the hood, we can still pass the properties and the methods of a certain object to another object by using prototypes. So let's switch Notion and let's start working. Here are the topics we will cover. We'll start by talking about what are object prototypes, how to set prototypes, and how to get prototypes. Of course, meanwhile, we will also cover some details of working with prototypes. If you are not familiar with the idea of inheritance in objects, here is really a dead simple example that I'm pretty sure it makes it quite easy to understand. Of course, there are many other aspects, but here is just the main idea. So we have a basic object or a base object, a person which has the properties first name, which is a string, last name, which is also a string, and get full name, which is a method that receives no arguments and returns a string. Now, every student is also a person, which means that this arrow here, it means that the student is inheriting the properties and the methods from the class or from the object person. This is more commonly used in the context of classes, and this is what inheritance or subclassing would mean. But here the idea is pretty much the same for object. So the student is an object, and this object is also of type person, which means that it makes sense that each student has a first name, a last name, and a get full name. But in addition to that, students have a property that is not common to every person. The students, they have a university, right? So the students here, they are another type of object which is inheriting the properties of a person, but is also adding its own properties and methods. And the same thing for the inhabitant. So inhabitant is a person, and I mean, I know it's maybe a little bit hard to think of a person who is not an inhabitant, but maybe you don't live in a city, maybe you are traveling in another context or something. So here the inhabitant also inherits the properties and the methods from the person object, but it adds its own, the city property, right? And this city property is also of type string. Now, a student does not have a city property, as you can see here. So when you think about students, you would think about this context. So if I select it here quickly, and then let's say I change this line to red, then we would be talking about the set of these two objects here. Now, if I am talking about an inhabitant, I would be talking about all the properties of the person object and methods as well, plus the property of the inhabitant. So I would be talking about these two sets of objects. So let's start by understanding what is exactly a prototype in JavaScript. I'm going to create a new file here. I'm going to call this prototype.js. And the prototype in JavaScript is basically this base object. If I look at the person here, we could think about this as being the prototype, which is then passed to both the student and the inhabitant. This means that the student is going to inherit all the properties and the methods of the person, and the same thing for the inhabitant. So in JavaScript terms, every object that has a prototype set to another object is going to inherit all the properties and all the methods of that other object. Let's here define a person again, and we're going to say first name, and this first name is going to be John, and the last name is going to be Doe. We're going to have the get full name method, and this get full name is going to return backticks this dot first name, and this dot last name. Now, if I want to use this person as a blueprint for other objects, I can actually just copy the name of the variable, and here I can say const student, and I can set the prototype by setting this weird property underscore proto, and this is going to be set to person. And now here I can say university Harvard. Now, if I want to access the student.firstname, so if I were to console.log student.firstname, you will see that this will work just fine. Let's come here to the console and we're going to run node prototype.js and we have John here. Of course, if I change the first name of the student, so if I say student dot first name is going to be equal to Jane, then this is not going to change the prototype. Okay, this is not going to change the person. So I'm going to save this file, this console.log, and I'm going to show you that now it's correctly printing Jane. If I were to say student.getFullName, I will get the correct output, Jane Doe, like so. But if I were to console.log the person.firstname, I will still get John. Of course, here, right? Of course, this makes total sense because from an inheritance perspective, we don't really want to change the prototype object. We don't want to change the original object that is used as a prototype. Otherwise, this would actually cause a lot of issues because whenever we wanted to create a new object based on that original prototype, we would have a different value for the first name. Let's now create another object here. We're going to say inhabitant. And this will also have the proto property set to person. And this is going to have a city, which we can say again, Berlin. Now here, inhabitant and student are of course two different objects, but they have the same prototype. If I were to print here, after setting the student.firstname equals Jane, so here I could set directly after creating, and then I use the person here. Once I print the inhabitant.firstname, we will see that we will still have John. Just that's to confirm that we are using the original object. Awesome. Now that we know what prototypes are and what they are used for, let's talk about how to set prototypes. One way is by using this property here, the __proto__, and then set this to the object that we want to be the prototype. Another way is by using object.create and then passing the object as an argument to this method. Here, if I pass person, then this will still print John on the screen. Let's come back here to the terminal and run node prototype.js, and this prints John as expected. Yet another way for us to change the prototype of an object is to, well, let me do a little bit of cleanup here, and pardon for the quite messy example, but you will get what I mean. So it's a good example. If I try to print inhabitant.university, let's save this and run here in the console. So node prototype.js, I get undefined, right? Because the inhabitant object has no university property because the person has no university property. Now, if I were to come here and say object.setPrototypeOf, and then here I'm going to pass inhabitant, and then I'm going to pass the new prototype, which I will take student for the sake of demonstration purposes, and I console.log the university again. Now this university is going to print Harvard. So if I run, now you see that we have a new prototype to the object. As you can see, we can change the prototype dynamically, and this is something that, well, if you are working with the prototypes, you need to be aware of that this can lead to certain bugs. Of course, now if I were to print inhabitant.firstname, this would still be defined, right? Because the first name is coming from the student, but as you can see, it's not the same as the person. So the first name here is Jane, and this first name is actually coming from the student prototype rather than the person prototype. So there is a lot of room for bugs, a lot of room for errors. I would never recommend, I mean, never again is a strong word, but I would rarely recommend you change the prototype at runtime by using this possibility that JavaScript gives to you. Of course, you can also, I mean, as I said, this is just one more way of setting the prototype. In general, here you could create an empty object, and then you would say object.setPrototype of inhabitant, and you set it to person. This is also okay. And then here we will just print John on the screen when we try to print the first name. This works as before. Great. Now that we know how we can set the prototype of an object, well, the title of this video means prototype change. So let's maybe try
to create a certain chain of prototypes, right? So if I were to now, let's say that, let's come back here to my diagram, and let's try to switch things around a little bit. Let's say that every student is now an inhabitant. So now it means that every student is going to have the inhabitant as the prototype. Let me just center everything up here nicely, and like so, and here like so, and here like so. Perfect. So now inhabitant is going to inherit the properties from the person object, and then student is going to inherit the properties of inhabitant. Let's come back here, and now we are going to have then the inhabitant being the one at the top. Const inhabitant underscore proto person, and here we can say city. That's going to be Berlin. And the student is going to have the inhabitant as its prototype. Now, student then is going to have a property called city as well. If I were to console.log student.city, this is going to print Berlin. And if I were to console.log student.university, this is going to print Harvard. The recommended way of getting an object's prototype is to use the object.getPrototype method, and then we pass student here, like so. If I were to console.log the output of this function, let's save this and let's come back to the console and run node prototype.js, you will see that I have only city Berlin. I don't have any of the properties that come from the person object, even though person is the prototype for the prototype of the student, right? So the student has the inhabitant as its prototype, and the inhabitant has the person as its prototype, which means that the inhabitant object inherits all the properties and the methods from person, but here it's not being printed on a screen, and that's because this underscore proto property is not enumerable. Now, for our purposes here, there are of course other consequences of not being enumerable, but for our purposes here, it simply means that this property is not going to be printed on the screen. If I were to say console.log, and then here is going to be student.property is enumerable, and I pass the key proto like so, and I save this and I run the code here, then you will see that at the bottom I get false. This means that the proto is not enumerable. Another way of checking if a certain object is a prototype of another object is by having or by using the, and then here I'm gonna just inhabitant. So it's by using the object.isPrototype of method, and then here I can pass student. This is going to output true, as you may expect. Let's save this and let's run in the console. I get true here. Let me just do a little bit of cleanup, remove these things. So the inhabitant is a prototype of student. Also, the person is a prototype of student, okay? Because here we are talking about a prototype chain, which means that the person is the prototype or is a prototype for, no, actually is the prototype for inhabitant, which is the prototype for student, which means that the person is within this prototype chain for student. So the is prototype of actually returns true if the argument is in the prototype chain. If I had more here, let's say, I don't know, human, right? I mean, I cannot think of a human who is not a person, but let's say, and then I had human dot or animal, maybe animal is better, right? So animal, then we have people, then we have inhabitants and students. And then if I say animal dot is prototype of student, this would also return true. So let's save this and let's see the output. And as expected, both of them are true. Of course, if I come here and I say inhabitant dot is prototype of person, this is false, right? Because person is the prototype of inhabitant, which means that we are following, this is a directed relationship, right? It does not mean that inhabitant is the prototype of person because it's also in the chain. No, it follows, it's a one directional logic. So if I save this and I run, then of course I get false, and an object is never the prototype of itself. So if I have person dot is prototype of person, this is also going to be false. That's it for today, and in the next video we will focus on classes.
I know I said the language does not have real classes under the hood, and that's still true. Whenever you see the class keyword or class constructs, this is basically synthetic sugar around functions, but this synthetic sugar actually makes it much more intuitive for us to implement some of the concepts of object-oriented programming in JavaScript. So if you don't want to miss the next video, and if you are enjoying the videos in general, make sure to subscribe to the channel and you will get notifications when the next videos are out. Thanks for your time, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye.